Welcome to Novara Live, which tonight has a running theme. Sir Tony Blair, and that's for three reasons. First, as I'm sure you've seen, his apparently lifelong ambition to introduce ID cards is set to finally become a reality after Starmer has announced plans for a mandatory UK digital ID. Second, it's been revealed that the Tony Blair Institute, which lobbies governments to introduce policies like digital ID cards, is being paid hundreds of millions of pounds by tech billionaire Larry Ellison for its efforts. And third, because it's today being reported that Tony Blair is in discussion to take control of the Gaza Strip. Yes, overbearing tech solutions and colonial adventures in the Middle East. It's almost as if 28 years after first reaching Downing Street, the ghost of Tony Blair never really went away. I've got some great guests lined up to discuss all of this. I've got someone from Big Brother Watch, who's, of course, against ID cards, someone from Labour Together, who's in favour of them, I should say the controversial Labour Together, and journalist Peter Geoghegan, who has done the original investigation into the relationship between Tony Blair and Larry Ellison. I'll also be joined later, of course, by Aaron Bastani, who I know has some fairly strong opinions about Sir Tony. As ever, if you want to support the work we do, you can go to novaramedia.com/support and do let us know your comments in the YouTube chat or on the hashtag Novara Live. Keir Starmer has today announced plans to introduce mandatory digital ID cards.
I am announcing this government will make a new free-of-charge digital ID mandatory for the right to work by the end of this Parliament. Let me spell that out. You will not be able to work in the United Kingdom if you do not have digital ID. It's as simple as that.
The government has said that digital ID will be available to all UK citizens and legal residents, and it will be mandatory in order to work. They've said it won't be mandatory for those who aren't looking to work, so that might include students, pensioners. They will have the option to obtain one, so it'll be optional for them, mandatory if you want to work. Officials have said it will not function like a traditional identity card and that people will not be required to carry it in public. So the idea, it doesn't make us just yet a papers, please society. And ministers have so far ruled out requiring the ID for access to healthcare or welfare payments. But the man who could be the next PM is not reassured.
The benefits are clear. The state can control every single aspect of your life. They can know where you are at any given moment in time. They can see what money goes in and out of your accounts. They can decide, no. You can't go to Marbella. You've used up your carbon credit for the year. Now, you might say I'm exaggerating, but these are the endless possibilities that could happen with digital ID. And frankly, for me, I saw enough during the pandemic with vaccine passports. It created a two-tier society of those who could go to places, those who could travel, all based on the fact that unless you were vaxxed, you were a danger because you might pass the virus on to somebody else. Then we learned that simply wasn't true, and yet our freedoms have been taken away for that period of time in a way that had never happened before. I am personally, vehemently opposed to this in every single way.
Of course, it's not just the populist right who are against ID cards, but also privacy campaigners. And earlier today, I spoke to one of them. Jasleen Chaggar is legal and policy officer at Big Brother Watch.
Mandatory digital ID would be a civil liberties nightmare. Not only would it subject millions of us to unwarranted identity checks as we go about our daily life, it would also allow the government to amass vast quantities of information about our interactions with the state and our behaviours, which then are centralised in government databases and become a really attractive honeypot for hackers and malign actors who want to have access to that information.
I mean, I suppose from my perspective, I understand all the arguments against it. But then when I sort of see people talking about how this could become some sort of dystopia, I look over at continental Europe and they pretty much all have mandatory ID cards. Lots of them have digital ID, Estonia, Belgium. I think lots of them are sort of already, I suppose, migrating their physical ID to digital ID. Why, when it hasn't gone particularly wrong on the continent, would it go so wrong here?
Well, I think no one's saying that we're going to turn into North Korea tomorrow if we have a mandatory digital ID system. But what it does represent is this sort of slow erosion of civil liberties. It's not normal in this country to have to identify yourself to the authorities when you're not suspected of doing anything wrong. It's not normal to have to surrender vast amounts of personal information just to access basic services to which you're entitled. And so I think it would really alter the relationship between the citizen and the state, because at the moment we exist in a largely trust-based society where we prove who we say we are when we need to, using the documents that are appropriate to that situation. And this would really reverse that by having this state-mandated identity document that could potentially record every time you're using that document to prove your identity, and centralize that into government databases.
Keir Starmer has said this will, well, at the moment, he's saying this will only be used to check whether you have a right to work. He's not saying that sort of it will be a papers, please society where police, I suppose, can just ask you when you're walking down the street or if you attend a protest to show you your ID. I suppose you presumably think there's a slippery slope, and that if it's introduced, even if legislation says it's only for when you apply for a job, you think it will be inevitable that this will become sort of something far more expansive?
Well, exactly. Mandatory ID systems are highly susceptible to what's called mission creep, and that means that they'll be used beyond the purpose for which they were originally intended. And already, when you look at the way this is being talked about, organisations like the Tony Blair Institute and Labour together are suggesting it could be used and linked up to your NHS records and your education data, used to pay taxes, vote online, and even for your online shopping and your sort of loyalty cards and things like that. And so there is a worry that it is able to create this really expansive system of personal information that's then linked together across government departments. And the things that you originally gave access to that data for, it's then used far beyond those original purposes.
Again, I suppose going back to the European examples, have we seen that kind of mission creep? And I suppose if we have, is it not the case that people tend to be fine with it because it makes life more convenient? I suppose I think of my smartphone, and it does seem like people are willing to trade privacy for convenience in quite a lot of areas in life. My guess is that Mark Zuckerberg has a lot more information about me than the UK government does. So why should we be so concerned about giving up this data to the UK government if it does make our lives more convenient?
I think you're right that we are all used to giving up far more personal information today than we were, say, 20 years ago. But I don't think that means that the public's ready to surrender their data privacy and their data security just to access basic services. And I think it's a little bit defeatist to say that, well, just because Mark Zuckerberg knows everything about me and knows me better than I know myself, that we should then give up that power to the government as well. You have to remember, when you're building these sorts of mass surveillance infrastructures, it's very hard to then dismantle them. So it's not just today's government, it's all future governments that you're handing over that power to as well. And that's a really dangerous precedent to set.
And of course, I mean, you're called Big Brother Watch, so sort of people think of that book, which is all quite grim. Although I suppose the surveillance state, I mean, we have as much surveillance on us as was in the book. I think if you think of the amount of CCTV, the amount of information that sort of all these companies and the government already has on us, let's be frank. I suppose, let's use our imaginations here. What is the world that you think digital ID cards could lead us into?
Well, I think how this is being envisioned is that it would allow this sort of joined up ecosystem across government departments. So that means that, if I made a benefits claim, then I think the idea of when AI is applied to these systems, the idea is that potentially they would just look at your medical records and determine whether you're eligible for those benefits automatically without having to even have your sort of human intervention there, or that the police could also have access to your healthcare records, or this sort of omniscient government that can see everything about your interactions with them. And also, if these sort of systems are linked to you proving your identity in the private sector, so for example, where you have to prove your age to buy alcohol or use age-gated services online or gambling services, then if there's what's called phone home capability, and that means that the digital ID is logged on the government record, that means that the government would also have really detailed records about what you're doing in the private sector, which is none of its business. And so the fear is that they would have this sort of comprehensive vantage point, which leads to a situation which there's a huge asymmetry of power, and the government knows everything about your life just to administer the state, whereas in reality, it's supposed to administer our rights and freedoms.
I suppose we do have a lot of experience, I suppose, of governments introducing mandatory ID cards, mainly from the continent. I suppose India have also done it, lots of countries around the world. And I suppose, are there any examples we can point to, concrete examples, where someone has introduced a mandatory ID card and it's gone very wrong?
Yeah, you're right. India has one of the world's largest digital identity systems, the Aadhaar system, and it is linked to biometric information. And we've seen a lot of examples where it's gone wrong there. So there were data breaches which led to people's information being leaked online and being sold for £6. And this is really personal, identifying information that is linked to information that is as sensitive as your DNA and your fingerprints. And when you have a single point of access to basic services through a digital ID like they do in India, which means you can only get sort of welfare benefits if you can use your digital ID, where these systems fail, it can be catastrophic. So there's been reports of farmers whose fingerprints had sort of eroded because of the work they do, not being able to access grain subsidies, and people have died as a result of that. And then, of course, there's a chilling effect on free expression. And so privacy activists in India have expressed concerns that the government would know about their activities, and they're organising with these kinds of systems. And because their sort of health records are linked to this, there's also been reports that people have avoided getting treatment for HIV and AIDS because they're concerned that that will then also be on their government records and accessible across departments. So there are real human effects of this. And I will say closer to home, with the e-visa system, that's a mandatory digital ID of sorts for over 4 million legal migrants who are here in the UK. And there's been a whole raft of inaccuracies where people have logged into the system, found other people's migration status and information on their accounts, and it's left people stranded at the airport, getting bills for the NHS, which they shouldn't have, and being unable to sign up to jobs. And so there are real world implications for all of this.
That was Jasleen Chaggar from Big Brother Watch with the case against digital IDs. So who's backing them? Well, according to polling from last year, the public were mostly fine with the idea. So in late November, More in Common found that 53% of the public supported introducing digital ID cards for everyone in the UK. Only 19% of people were opposed, and ID cards were particularly popular with Reform and Tory voters. But Starmer's announcement has potentially radicalised voters against the idea. So a snap poll from YouGov today shows that now more people oppose than support digital IDs, and Reform voters are especially negative, with 58% now strongly opposing digital ID. So either they're sort of following the line of Nigel Farage, who's very much against them, or the fact that Keir Starmer supports them has persuaded them they must be a bad idea. One man, though, is still keen.
Digital ID will make our interactions with each other and with the state faster, cheaper, and more reliable. It will allow us to judge who has a right to be in our country and who doesn't, and so solves one of the major challenges of immigration.
That was Tony Blair earlier this year, launching a report on digital ID from the Tony Blair Institute. That report was likely made possible by a man who could be in line to profit from the further digitisation of government records. That's Larry Ellison, the CEO of data software firm Oracle, who had donated over £250 million to the Institute. There'll be more on that topic later in the show. For now, the other organisation backing digital ID has also faced questions about their funding. Labour Together, the organisation founded by Morgan McSweeney and which masterminded Starmer's rise to power, released this report in June this year. So it's called BritCard, a progressive digital identity for Britain, which it said could help tackle illegal immigration. And the report even mocked up a version of the BritCard, which, as you can see here, would show on your smartphone whether you had the right to work and the right to rent, as well as documents like driving licenses. Starmer is very close to both Labour Together and the Tony Blair Institute, so presumably the line between these proposals and his announcement is a fairly direct one. But would digital ID cards achieve what both organisations have said they will enable the government to do, namely tackle illegal immigration? Well, the argument is that one of the UK's pull factors for illegal immigration is that, unlike the rest of Europe, we don't have mandatory ID cards. But as my colleague Ash Sarkar pointed out in the Cortado this morning, there doesn't seem to be any correlation between the amount of illegal working in a country and whether or not they have mandatory ID. This research from the Policy Department at the European Parliament shows the size of the shadow economy in European countries. The main takeaway is that it's generally larger the further east you go, so 33% of the Bulgarian economy is unregulated. But it's difficult to see how ID cards explain the differences. For example, France, Spain and Belgium all have digital ID cards, but have shadow economies between 14 and 16% of GDP. Meanwhile, the UK and Ireland, which don't, have shadow economies of only 10 to 11% of GDP. So does this undermine the central argument of Keir Starmer, Tony Blair and Labour Together? Well, earlier today, I spoke to one of the authors of the Labour Together report, Morgan Wild.
I think it is not the case that you can just have an ID card and it will magically shrink the shadow economy. What is common across those countries is that they are physical ID cards, and so they are subject to the same kind of problems that our right to rent, right to work checks are, in that you have to take on trust that they are happening. What is different about digital ID is you'll have a record of them occurring. And that means if a company or a landlord, has X number of employees or X number of people working there, X number of tenants, or X number of houses, you'll know that you don't need to worry about them. But if there's a mismatch from what you know about those companies, landlords, otherwise, you can focus your resources there.
Belgium does have digital ID. It says mandatory for all Belgian citizens over 12 to have electronic identity. So it's not the idea that these are all just bits of paper and this will be okay because we'll digitize it. It's not like we're the first people to think of the idea of having a digital ID. So sort of to say, well, their paper will be digital, so it will work better here. I'm not sure how convincing that is.
Yeah. I didn't realise that about Belgium specifically. I've been thinking more of France and other countries. I think that is an absolutely fair point, that it will not work on its own. It has to work in concert with other activities. If you look at one change that we're making, I think this is like an important point about how different systems speak to each other. For example, we are creating a national landlord database because we, as part of the Renters' Rights Bill, Labour is concerned about dodgy landlords who there is no method of regulating them, even if you have rental regulation. If you pair that database with the right to rent checks that you have a record of, you should be able to shrink the number of properties that you know you need to look at.
And so I suppose at the moment we've been talking about, will it work, will it be effective? Let's talk about what people are concerned about and why people think this might be, well, I suppose some people might be concerned actually that it will make it harder to work if you don't have documentation because these are already marginalised people. But let's focus on the other concerns people might have, which is that this will be a slippery slope. Keir Starmer says he's introducing it for one reason, but then it ends up being massively expanded once it's legislated for and once the infrastructure is out there. An example which will be, at the forefront of the minds of many of our viewers is the Terrorism Act. So this was passed in 2000 by Tony Blair, obviously the big advocate of ID cards. And what you saw there in Parliament was people saying, no, of course this won't be used to target people who do property damage. This is only for people who are a genuine threat to the British public. That's why we need to pass this sweeping legislation. 25 years later, under Keir Starmer, under the man who wants to introduce these ID cards, suddenly you've got this legislation used to prescribe an organisation like Palestine Action. So when Keir Starmer, as he's saying at the moment, says, look, this isn't about a papers, please society, you won't be mandated to carry your digital ID, the police won't be able to ask you for it, why should our audience have any confidence that those, those commitments made now will be worth anything in 5 or 10 years' time?
Yes, I think there are two potential defences that we should be thinking about as people who care about civil liberties as we roll this out. One is in the precise technical design. So there's a number of technical choices that you can make to make it more or less resilient to becoming more surveillance orientated over time. And I think that's a very good argument for making choices that put the sovereignty over data with the citizen rather than with the government. The second defence is the nature of the legislation. So if we draw that legislation tightly, have a proper legislative debate about it, as I'm sure we will, that should provide a defence against excessive interpretation. But there is no defence ultimately against the sovereign parliament then changing those rules later on, but there is no defence against that happening now.
The infrastructure will make it easier, right? So it will be easier to go that extra step because all you'll need to do is something in Parliament to say, actually, police do have the right to check your digital ID. It will already be built. So if Keir Starmer becomes even more authoritarian than he already is, in 5 years' time and says, I want to have a papers, please society, this will already be built. And obviously the same applies to Nigel Farage. I want to ask a question about trust, because I think a lot of people's issue with ID cards is the idea that these are being introduced for an ulterior purpose. So we're told this is about sort of making sure that Labour sort of working is all above board, that you don't have illegal working. Obviously, Keir Starmer is making out that this is all about migration. But I suppose when people look at who is backing this, who are the sort of the brains behind this, so you've got the Tony Blair Institute, which has received £250 million from Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison, of course, the CEO of Oracle, which provides digital services to governments, so could profit handsomely. So sort of like, why is Tony Blair pushing it? And then we've got you guys at Labour Together, who are the other big supporters of ID cards. You've been fined for not declaring £700,000 in donations, much of it from hedge funds. So why should anyone trust your motives? I know you're sort of here as you used to work for the Citizens Advice Service. You want public services to work more efficiently for people. That's the story you're telling. But why should anyone believe that you guys at Labour Together or the people over at the Tony Blair Institute really have our interests at heart?
I think that the trust should be in the transparency or otherwise of the legislative process. So, I mean, I can say here that, my career has been in trying to make public services work better for the lowest income, most vulnerable people in society, and people can trust that or not. Ultimately, what we need to do through the legislative process is have transparency over the technical specification of what's done so that people can demonstrate and investigate for themselves whether what is being produced is consistent with the principles I've set out here, and two, whether the legislative framework that is being put in place is robust or not. I would say I would expect this to be built within the public sector by the gov.uk team, who are we don't have much in our kind of state capacity that is the envy of the world, but actually our digital government is pretty good and pretty looked on by the rest of the world as one of the world leaders.
To make clear to our audience, we didn't make that thumbs up appear. I don't know if that was an AI recognizing your thumbs up or if it was something you pressed, but just to make that clear. I suppose just to hammer down on this issue of trust, because I know you're saying that you're coming to this sort of with a clear conscience, but do you not see how it is a problem that this is being pushed by people like the Tony Blair Institute, who are getting funded by Oracle, and you guys at Labour Together, who are fined for not having declared donations, much of them from big business and hedge funds? Like, if you're trying to push forward a policy which people are already naturally inclined to be very suspicious of, that's not a good starting point, is it?
I don't agree. I think the argument about a digital ID will be had on the merits. I feel like I work for an entirely transparent organisation about funding. I don't feel any hand on my shoulder guiding me to particular policy proposals or solutions. I mean that entirely genuinely. And we put papers out into the world. You can read them. You can see what the arguments are. The government can receive them, talk about them, put them forward, and then we can have a big debate about whether ID cards are the right kind of answer for Britain or not, and do that in a transparent way so that people can make their own judgments about whether to trust or not.
I know it's not your job to declare donations, but just because I know that this is what my audience are going to be thinking having you on the show, that to sort of say you work for an entirely transparent organisation when it didn't declare £700,000 worth of donations. And in my mind, that was because they didn't want it known that Keir Starmer was being backed by private business interests. Now, when you're putting forward a digital ID card, I think people, you can't be surprised if they think maybe the reason you're saying this is because you're being backed by private business interests. As I say, I know this is not your job to do this declaring, but just does it not make your life harder as someone who is trying to advocate for a policy that I have no reason to believe you don't believe in, that's the background you're working within?
I think I've been at Labour Together for about a year now, and in my time, my experience, all I have been doing is arguing for the kinds of policy changes that I think will help make Britain a better place.
That was Morgan Wild from Labour Together speaking to me earlier today. So we've had an argument against ID cards, an argument for. Now I'm going to go to Aaron Bastani. Welcome to the show. Where do you stand?
Be here, Michael.
Where do you stand on digital ID?
So I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea. I think it can be good. I think it can be bad. I think it has some advantages, some disadvantages. I think it's probably fair to say that it is at odds with the tradition of British politics and British public life and British civil society. But I do find it strange, Michael, I have to say this, the exact same people who say we aren't a papers, please society, who are opposing ID cards vehemently, people like Nigel Farage and Reform, the exact same people insisted that electoral fraud in this country is rife and that the only solution is, guess what, bringing ID to vote. I find that rather ironic. We're not a papers, please society, but please bring your papers when you want to go and vote for a government in an election. Make your mind up. If you're going to want me to bring ID to things, then I don't want to bring my bloody utility bills to the world and its wife. So on some things, there are absolutely advantages. You can imagine, for instance, one platform which integrates passport, access to welfare, driving license, your student discounts for things all in one platform, saves time, bureaucracy, money. Yeah, maybe this even pays for itself. I can buy that. In terms of identity fraud, yep, I can buy that. Reducing benefit fraud, probably. I can buy that. But the claims being made around migration, this will help deal with illegal migration or illegal working. Well, first of all, you need a specific kind of visa now if you're not a UK national and you're entering the country, which the police can ask for. And this is not a piece of identification that will be only in in receipt of people who are not UK nationals who are working here, everybody will be expected to have it. And it does feel a little bit like a solution without a problem. And it does feel that basically Blair lost this fight 20 years ago and he wants to go around too. It basically feels like that's what's driving this. And the fact you've got Larry Ellison involved, we'll talk about him more later on the show, and the Tony Blair Institute pushing this, or as I like to call them, the Oracle Institute. Of course, that's Larry Ellison's business. He's worth hundreds of billions. He's giving the Tony Blair Institute hundreds of millions. His game is AI, big data. I purely on the basis of that oppose this, right? The idea that Oracle and big tech are helping push a policy agenda involving ID cards. Well, therefore, I oppose ID cards. But in the abstract, I can see the benefits. I also understand, like I say, the sort of historical cultural arguments against them within a UK setting. But I do find it kind of weird, Michael, in 2025 that you have to take your gas bill somewhere. That does kind of feel a little bit strange. I won't lie. And I'll finish with this. If you speak to tobacconists, newsagents, they'll say that trading standards basically don't exist anymore. Compared to 15 years ago, they do not exist. There is a ton of counterfeit and illegal tobacco, as one example, being sold because enforcement of law is very, very weak. It has been very weak, really, since the coalition government of 2010. So trading standards is weak. The cops don't exist in large parts of the country for quite a few offences. You don't have enforcement of a ton of stuff. Like where I live in Portsmouth, Michael, you might not believe this. People can Google this. The speeding cameras have been switched off in Portsmouth, I think now for 15 years because the local authority couldn't afford to run them anymore, right? So you have so much basic stuff which isn't functioning, from the police to trading standards to things like speed cameras. The cameras are there, but they're not recording anything. But you're saying, actually, rather than resolve this stuff and actually, create a more effective state at a basic, elementary, everyday level, we're going to create this new digital infrastructure and it's going to sort everything out. And I just don't think it will. I just don't think it will. So, you can choose to have the big rallying ideological counter arguments. I'm sympathetic to those. They're not my arguments. I don't really understand why Labour are picking this as a policy issue, unless you're being cynical and they're looking for a fight to distract from the fact they have no real agenda for government. This is quite cheap. Within a year or two, people will see it. It's a physical change to people's everyday relationship to government. And it's something that ideologically Blair was obsessed with. And therefore, the Starmer government is quite happy to push. It doesn't feel like a massively important thing. But equally, if you were the government, you said, you know what, we're gonna quadruple trading standards budgets for this year. We're going to double HMRC and quadruple trading standards. That's not going to get you headlines. Whereas we're going to introduce ID cards. And we don't really know what the benefits are going to be. We've not really measured the benefits. That's going to get a lot more headlines. So it feels partly about media management, Blair Mark II and a solution in search of a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, ID cards is something that I've never managed to get particularly passionate about because they have them in all of Europe, right? And it seems to work fine. I think if they made a positive case for them about how it sort of links up various sort of services the state provides, which seems to be sort of why they're popular in somewhere like Estonia. I mean, even in India, it seems like the ID cards, obviously our guest talked about a bad situation that emerged from them, a person who was unable to get subsidies because they'd worked too hard on their finger. But I think on aggregate, a lot more people get those grain subsidies now because of the ID card than they did before, because it used to be distributed via local politicians and there was lots of corruptions and lots of leakage. So I think most people agree sort of in terms of economic development, the ID card system in India has been a positive. The idea that we have this unique, exceptional culture, which means that we can't have ID cards, but Spain, Germany, France, Belgium can, I don't find particularly persuasive. But I'm also not going to go out on a limb and say we need to have ID cards. I kind of agree with you, Aaron, that it's to some degree sort of a solution without a real problem. And you were saying there sort of how this seems to be a decision made because of political reasons and they want a headline. And this is where it might really backfire because, as I said sort of earlier in the show, this used to be popular with the public and now the public hate it because Keir Starmer's announced it. People are really mobilised about this. So the government petition I sort of took this screenshot about an hour ago when there were 1,181,000 people signing it. I'm looking at it now. It's already about 100,000 more in the last hour. So this is going up very quickly. Reform and GB News are sort of really mobilizing against this. So it seems like this might end up being a stick to beat Keir Starmer with. And it's sort of another one of those things where he wants to look tough on immigration, so chooses a policy which isn't actually going to do very much. And I think on immigration, this is, and especially on small boats, this is one where people are going to look at the results, not the messaging, because no one trusts Keir Starmer. Aaron, we've got some more Tony Blair themed stories coming along, really good ones actually. Before we move on to them though, can you tell me about Novara Media's next downstream IRL?
I can, Michael. I think it's on the 13th of next month, right?
Absolutely.
We're talking about the people involved in this book, Gaza, the story of a genocide. It's an anthology of some pretty remarkable people. Yara Hawari, Tarek Bakoni, Mariam Barghouti. Really, really exceptional books. Some of those involved Ahmed Al-Nouk, Omar Barghouti, like I say, Mona Chalabi. Some of those people will be joining us in Hackney on the 13th at Earth. This is a really, really important time to help set the political agenda around Palestine. And also, we now need to start thinking about what a post-conflict solution looks like. We now need to think about the future of Israel with regards to what happens if this conflict, this particular episode post-October 2023 dies down, whichever way that happens. You have these crazy proposals like Tony Blair doing, Mandate of Palestine Mark II. But in any case, I now think it's really critical if there is something approximating a cessation of hostilities, even briefly, and of course that would still mean people dying. I'm under no illusions about that. I then think it's critical we have an informed, extensive political debate about the future of Palestine and also the future of this country's relationship with Israel. I think that's really, really critical. I personally think now, in the next year or two, we need to make the strongest possible argument that Israel should be a pariah state on the international stage. And this book, I think, really explains why. And it's great that we can put Palestinian voices at the center of that conversation. If you want to join us, like I say, at Earth in Hackney, London, that's on the 13th of October. Tickets are now available for sale. The link should be in the description below. Also, it'll of course be on YouTube afterwards. But I don't think you can beat live events. People love them, Michael, because so much of the political conversation happens online. Great thing. It's great that you can listen to all kinds of people more easily than ever before. But I think that adds real value when you can actually get in a room and listen to people and have interactions with them, like we used to in the old days. So if you want to join us, like I say, the tickets are available. Look forward to seeing some of you there. I think people will be signing books and whatnot. That's normally how these work. And maybe I'll see you for a drink afterwards as well.
Yeah, the link to that is in the description. They always clash with my Novara Live, so I never get to go, but I hear incredibly good things about Novara IRL. And do watch them, of course, on YouTube afterwards. What does it feel like to be the richest man in the world for a day? Well, just ask Larry Ellison.
Veteran tech boss Larry Ellison, founder and top shareholder of software giant Oracle, has seen his net worth soar by $70 billion in one day. You heard that right. That's after Oracle reported surging revenues after the Wall Street bell, driven by AI demand for cloud computing. Mr. Ellison now has a net worth of $364 billion, according to Bloomberg's Billionaires Index, after the biggest one-day jump in wealth ever recorded.
Yes, earlier this month, on the back of a bunch of deals with AI giants like OpenAI and a boost in Oracle shares, Larry Ellison was made the richest man in the world. He's since been overtaken again by his good friend Elon Musk, but he's still sitting on £360 billion. So what does a man with that much money spend his cash on? Well, according to a new report by Peter Geoghegan and Lucas Armin, he's spent $250 million of that on Tony Blair. The extraordinary sum has been invested in the Tony Blair Institute, or TBI, which shares Ellison's commitment to persuading governments to adopt technological solutions to problems as diverse as climate change, healthcare, and illegal immigration. And Blair has, of course, long been obsessive about the modernising power of technology. And Ellison has a more obvious financial interest in governments adopting tech solutions. His company makes billions in annual revenue, providing software and cloud computing services to government departments like the CIA and the UK Ministry of Defence. But what's Ellison's current obsession? Well, he appeared with Tony Blair earlier this year at the World Government Summit in Dubai.
The NHS in the UK has an incredible amount of population data, but it's fragmented. It's not easily accessible by these AI models. We have to take all of this data we have in our country and move it into a single, if you will, unified data platform. So we provide context. When we want to ask a question, we've provided that AI model with all the data they need to understand our country.
That was Ellison speaking in February this year. It's all very Dr. Evil with that background. But this was a major Tony Blair Institute publication a few months later, this August. So it's called Preparing the NHS for the AI Era, a digital health record for every citizen. In that report, the TBI found good reasons for building new digital health records with an existing system run by Oracle. It also said that using a system run by rival Palantir would be a controversial option and that its product had been slow to make progress, in part due to opposition from data privacy groups. So it's not exactly subtle. So should this close connection between a tech billionaire and our former Prime Minister concern us? Well, earlier today, I spoke to one of the authors of that investigation, Peter Geoghegan.
The Tony Blair Institute, the thing to kind of remember about the Tony Blair Institute in some respects is it's kind of come from nothing to be probably the biggest think tank in Britain. This is an organisation with a budget of 150 million, with staff of almost 900, active in over 40 countries. This is a big thing. It didn't exist in 2018, so it's a very big unit. And underneath that, what's funding it? A lot of that money comes from Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison has either given or pledged £257 million to the Tony Blair Institute. So this is really important for TBI Ellison. It's Ellison's personal foundation. So the money comes from Ellison's personal charitable foundation to TBI. And so it really is the kind of, this investigation was all about trying to understand what that money has done to TBI, trying to understand how and if it has changed TBI. And in many respects, I think it's fair to say we found that it has. But without Ellison's money, TBI would not be at the level of organisation it is today.
Our audience will be very familiar with Tony Blair. Some will be familiar with Larry Ellison, but he has been someone sort of in the background for quite a long time now. He's sort of suddenly come to prominence because he was very briefly the richest man in the world, also because talk of him taking over TikTok. He's a big supporter of Israel. But sort of in terms of your story, in terms of the relationship between Larry Ellison and the Tony Blair Institute, what should people know about this tech billionaire?
I think he's a fascinating character because, as you say, he is one of the kind of that clique of the tech billionaires that, the tech bros who could fit in the back of a taxi and rule the world. Larry Ellison is one of them. And most people, and I would actually say myself included until I started doing this work, I didn't know that much about it, I'll be honest with you. And I think most people don't. He's a kind of, some people, even older people, actually remember him as a name from the 90s. So he's been, unlike the Zuckerbergs of this world and Musk, he is actually somebody he's 81 years of age. He has a face that looks like a candle that's melted and somehow got stuck in this kind of orange hue. He's had this same pencil moustache for about 30 years. I think one thing that's really telling about Larry Ellison is the first biography of Ellison came out in 1997. And it's called, What's the Difference Between Larry Ellison and God? And asterisk, God doesn't think he's Larry Ellison. This is somebody who for a long time has thought that they are a master of the universe and has lived and worked as if that is the case. He is phenomenally influential at this point, and especially since January of this year. Like, he's somebody who's given money to Democrats, he's given money to Republicans, given money to non-Trump Republicans, but now is firmly in the Trump tank. Trump has called him a CEO of everything. His son, David, is the head of Paramount, owns Paramount. Paramount, obviously, Trump gave the go-ahead for that, for Skydance, them to merge Skydance. There's also talk now of them buying Warner Bros. As well. So he's emerging as a massive media mogul. He's very close. Elon Musk and him are kind of have been sparring partners, but also very close. Musk is not culturally dissimilar from Ellison in terms of how they see the world. I think that's quite important to see. This is not like, this is not somebody who doesn't have strong views. And one of the things that is so fascinating is one of the things he's got really strong views about is the National Health Service in Great Britain and its data, which I think is really telling. If someone who has this much money and this much power has, as he has done repeatedly, spoken about the NHS and its data, that shows you that there's something here that he really wants.
I suppose that's where, or the main issue where this relationship between Larry Ellison and Tony Blair and the Tony Blair Institute and the British government seems like it might be something that might matter to your average British citizen, which is that Tony Blair is lobbying for NHS data to be unified so it can be sold off to tech companies. Larry Ellison wants the NHS data to be unified so it can be sold essentially to him. And so he, it seems is lobbying via Tony Blair to the Labour government at the moment. I suppose talk about that, what you discovered, why people should care, I suppose.
So Tony Blair would say, and people who work for Tony Blair would say, look, Tony Blair really believes in this. He is a tech evangelist. He believes tech is going to save us. He thinks tech and AI are the things that are going to deliver what Labour wants in government, which is growth. And as soon as Labour got into power, Tony Blair was effectively, we have FOI responses, Freedom of Information Request responses, where he's meeting Peter Kyle, who actually used to be an advisor in the Tony Blair's second term, who was the tech secretary for a long time, is now the business secretary. He's saying, look, you have to go for this. You have to go for growth. You have to go for AI. So Blair believes this stuff himself. I think that's fair to say. But at the same time, what he is pushing and what TBI are pushing is very beneficial to companies like Oracle, and frankly, almost certainly to Oracle. So Oracle has had over £1 billion with the UK government contracts. It's very involved in data and data centres and providing data services to the UK government. Ellison has spoken repeatedly about wanting the NHS data and why. And I'm not a tech reporter, so when I first started looking at this sort of story, it's a bit like NHS data, it sounds a bit geeky and it sounds a little bit like, what's there really there? What's really fascinating, I only found this out really from talking to people who know a lot more about data than I do, is the NHS health data it's kind of like, Holy Grail is a cliche, but it is almost like this sort of mystical thing for big tech companies. Why? Because LLMs, large language models that power AI, they have now eaten everything. They've ripped off my books, they've ripped off lots of other people's books, they've pushed them into these AI machines, and they're running out of road. And so they want more data. And the NHS data is by far and away the most complete health data in the world. The only equivalent data, one expert told me, is veterans data in the US. Because veterans get free healthcare at point of use. Most countries in the developed world have a social insurance model, which is really different. So they don't have this sort of data. But veterans is by their very nature, that's not going to be as good a data set as an entire population of 60 million people dating back to 1948. So this data could allow huge, that's what the bet is. There could be huge opportunities to create new, to use this data to create pharmaceuticals, to use this data to create genomes, all sorts of other stuff, huge amount in private hands. So it's about taking this data in-house and using it. That's what Larry Ellison wants to do. He's talked about this. And Tony Blair Institute have basically very much been green-lighting this and pushing a very, very similar agenda. And it's what came out in our reporting a lot, both in the UK and internationally, was how, since Larry Ellison's money started coming into TBI, so just remember, £257 million pledged or given to the Tony Blair Institute. Since that started coming in, the organisation, TBI, has become more and more focused on tech. It used to do lots of other stuff around good governance around the world, around de-radicalisation. It does some of that stuff still, but if you talk to people internally, it's really not the priority. It is now tech is the priority. And it is really pushing high-tech solutions and big tech. And often you're actually seeing, some people told us in the organisation that they felt as if the two organisations were as one. Oracle and TBI would meet together. They have retreats together. Oracle would slide into TBI staff calendars, organising meetings, even effectively doing tech sales for Oracle, especially internationally. So these two organisations have become increasingly kind of aligned. And what you've seen effectively is, briefly, the world's richest man earlier this month, Larry Ellison, he's effectively been able to, I think it's fair to say, to buy access to Blair, and in that way buy access to governments internationally and particularly in the UK, because the relationship between this Labour government and Tony Blair is pretty close. A lot of the people in senior government positions come through or have connections into the new Labour, and as soon as they got into office, they were looking to TBI, and TBI was looking to them to be able to try advise them on what they should be doing. And quite a number, we can see this, quite a number of proposals from TBI have subsequently been taken up as government policy.
I'm sure lots of people sort of listening to this will find this somewhat unsavory. You've got the world's sort of second richest man, very close to Donald Trump, who now has sort of, it seems, quite a lot of influence over the UK government. I suppose the argument from the other side to steelman the case would be to say, look, yes, obviously Larry Ellison wants to make a profit here. He's not doing this from the kindness of his heart. But the NHS, sort of the centralisation of the NHS comes with lots of disbenefits, lots of problems. One of the benefits is you have this brilliant data set and someone might as well use it. So if this brilliant data set can be used to create new drugs, new therapeutics, sort of help us understand the causes of disease, then it should be used to that end. Obviously, it would be great if that could be done in-house by the NHS. But let's face it, if we want this to be done well, the only organisations that have the capacity to properly use LLMs, who has the data centres to do it and the technical know-how, are these major private companies from the United States. So long as the NHS can get a good price for it, us selling our data to the highest bidder and that highest bidder potentially being Larry Ellison, what's the problem?
In some ways, I kind of probably came to this story with a similar kind of mindset as well. Look, in some respects, yes, it might be unsavory, but what is the problem? It's striking. If you talk to people, the tech experts, you talk to people in the space, they will tell you a very different story. They're really like, look, they will say to you, look, there's a lot you could do with this. There's a lot you could, the UK could benefit from this. And rather than flogging it off in a kind of privatized, like the last piece of family silverware that you could get rid of, we've got rid of everything else. We've privatized everything else. Well, we've got this thing left. Let's get rid of this. They will say it doesn't have to be like this. You don't have to lock yourselves into US tech. And actually in doing so, you create a massive security risk. And you can already see this. Like Trump and Ellison are very close. You can see the risk in where we have Donald Trump in the White House and the UK stays locked in to Oracle software. You're then in a very vulnerable position. So you're creating not just financial risk, but actually potentially national security risks. And one of my biggest issue in some ways as I reported this story was also, this is a conversation. I think Tony Blair in particular and the Tony Blair Institute, and I think Blair himself, have really pushed this idea. This all has to be done really quickly, as in far too quickly to have a conversation about it. And the story of Britain has been pushing through things like that really quickly without any conversation. And that hasn't been very successful for the last 30 years. And that is something I think, if nothing else, there needs to be a proper conversation about, like, well, what are we doing here? What's going on? Who's benefiting and how is this working? And you can actually see in the policy papers that we've been able to get access through, where they're trying to craft messages, both government and TBI in consort, to kind of assuage the public who are quite fearful. People are right, I think, understandably concerned about data. They do care about it. And to try and say, look, this is all fine. But actually, I think that really speaks to the fact that it isn't, and there needs to be a much bigger conversation than one that has been so far.
That was Peter Geoghegan talking about the cosy relationship between Larry Ellison and Tony Blair. You can read his full report on his Substack, Democracy for Sale. I really do recommend it. Really, really interesting. There's also a version currently on The New Statesman. I'll read out a response from the Tony Blair Institute that was quoted by Peter in his article. So they say, "We don't advocate for technology solutions because we work with Oracle. We work with Oracle and other technology companies because we believe technology holds the key to the future. TBI is impartial when supporting government clients in technology delivery. The choice of technology provider is solely a government decision." Make of that what you will. Aaron, the figures here were just remarkable. Like, when I was reading this story, £250 million given to one NGO by one billionaire. Like, other think tanks, the IPPR or whatever, I think they have an annual turnover of 4 million or so. Did I say? But £250 million. It's next level, isn't it?
It is next level. I think the turnover of the Tony Blair Institute, or the political wing of Oracle, as I think we should call it, their turnover in 2023 was coming up to $150 million US. It's now $150 million US plus. They are advising governments in 40 countries. They have more than 1,000 members of staff. This is orders of magnitude bigger than any kind of NGO or think tank we've ever seen in Britain. Orders of magnitude. It's incomparable to Demos or Policy Exchange or the IPPR. These almost look naively childlike and sweet compared to the TBI. And that's really concerning. It wasn't that long ago that people were saying Elon Musk, the world's wealthiest person, not a British national. He should not be interfering. By the way, I agree with this argument. I made this argument. He should not be interfering in the political process by giving £100 million to Reform or anybody on the right. And of course, he would be able to do that entirely legally by donating £100 million via a business holding here in the UK. That would be entirely legal. And people are saying, oh, that shouldn't happen. And at the time, I was saying, well, hold on. What do you think about Larry Ellison and Oracle giving all this money to the Tony Blair Institute? By the way, if you've been to Labour Party conference recently, like last year, the only game in town was the Tony Blair Institute. The biggest panels, the biggest names, the biggest topics, all standing room only. Those events at Labour conference by the TBI. It was pretty clear it was the most influential organisation at that event. And as you've made clear, $350 million US, £250 million are being given to that by a man who was briefly the world's wealthiest person on earth. But you have no problem with that. But you have a problem with Elon Musk giving £100 million to Reform. And there's a clear double standard there. This should not be happening. This should not be happening. The Tony Blair Institute, alongside Labour together, I think, are freewheeling policy for government in a way that is completely unaccountable, hasn't been done in this country ever before like this. And that will be a criticism increasingly you hear from the right. Guess what? It's correct. There was somebody in the comments earlier saying, after we did this piece, see, Aaron, now this is why you can't trust ID cards. I said in the first piece about ID cards, it's precisely why I don't support this idea, because it's being implemented by the Starmer government, which is in hock to the Tony Blair Institute, elite big tech interests like Oracle. I think other people might be involved as well. That's why I don't support it. But the reality is, I do believe in the state. I do believe the state is the corrective to our overarching corporate power. I'm a socialist. Right? I don't believe in a UBI, for instance. But if you think everybody needs a UBI, guess what? That's going to be quite a lot of bureaucracy. The state's going to have quite a lot of data on you. It needs that anyway for things like child benefit, JSA, pensions, all kinds of benefits. The NHS, to be effective, needs all kinds of data on you. Right? I have no problem with a socialist state in the abstract having access to all kinds of data that I would never want a private corporate entity to have. Right? But going back to this, Larry Ellison's relations as well to the IDF, he was involved in fundraisers for the IDF. I think he's the biggest private fundraiser for the IDF in the United States as a private individual. His son, as was mentioned, has massive interests in regards to culture. They're involved in the purchase of TikTok as well. They'll be one of the holders of TikTok as an asset. So bad news. I think it says a lot that is wrong in the Anglosphere in regards to the deep relationships between business, big tech, and politics. And I think those connections should be severed. This idea that, Labour is the voice of the working class, they're the voice of organised labour, who are in coalition with a wider range of interests, but that's how it's been for 100 years. We've got to fight for it. This is new, okay? This is new. Somebody worth $400 billion US, one or two with regards to the world's wealthiest person, having a political wing, in my view, freewheeling policy, where there is a massive interest for Oracle to be able to sell services in the future, but also to buy data in the future from the likes of the NHS. I think clearly it's just a huge conflict of interest. I mean, if there is a national ID card scheme, and there's a ton of data that's bought with the ID card scheme, and you can imagine the data, right? There's 69 million people, 60 million plus have this ID card, or let's say 55 million plus have this ID card. It's geotagged, it knows where we go, it aligns with our purchases, it can just know absolutely everything about you. That is data Oracle is going to want. That is data third parties are going to want. Now, you said about AI and this data the NHS has being of huge value for LLMs, which, they could sort a lot of problems out. In the last few days, we've seen a potential cure for Huntington's, for instance, a gene therapy, extraordinary. And there'll be a lot more of that happening as a result of machine learning and big data being applied to medical research and innovation. But the point is, who's going to benefit from that? Which is why I would want that data to be publicly owned. I would want the research spin-offs to be publicly owned. Yes, they might be able to collaborate with other private sector actors. I think they would have to be British companies, right? So AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, for instance, two examples. They should not be working with US big tech, and they should not be selling our valuable data off to the world's wealthiest or second wealthiest person.
And they probably shouldn't be doing it on the advice of someone who is being paid hundreds of millions of pounds. Well, I suppose Tony Blair says he doesn't claim an income from the Tony Blair Institute, but let's say they shouldn't do it based on the advice of an institute taking hundreds of millions of pounds from an individual who could well be set to benefit from said policy. And we've got more Blair coming up when we'll talk about the strange new plan to put him in charge of Gaza. First, though, this is our latest update from Kieran Andreou on the Gaza aid flotilla.
Hi guys, I'm just going to do you a quick update today. We're just off the coast of Crete still with the rest of our boats. Bad news, I'm afraid. Late last night, our boat, family boat, suffered serious engine failure. The captain and crew spent most of the night trying to revive the engine but didn't succeed. We even had help from other boats. Nothing worked. So family boat has now formally been decommissioned and will not sail for the rest of the journey from Crete to Gaza to deliver aid to the humanitarian corridor. The good news is that there are enough spaces on all of the other boats for people to be reallocated. So we're waiting to hear about reallocation and who's going to go where. I'll update you as soon as I know where I'm going and update you on the composition of the boats and so on. We still absolutely are committed to setting sail. Everybody is determined to set sail for Gaza later today, but of course it's pretty chaotic. It's a small space. There's 30 people, makes a lot of stuff. So everybody is doing their best to, as quickly as possible, disembark the boat, which means getting everything out with the boat landing on the top deck, going from there. It's been a pretty emotional morning. We've all been together solidly for nearly a month now, on and off, under the threat of Israeli drones, and suffering from prolonged sleep deprivation. So we've all got to know each other extremely well. We all feel very close to each other. We all feel safe with each other as well. And obviously we are aware that we're sailing into a dangerous zone. So having to be broken up at this stage does feel pretty cruel and stressful, I have to say.
That was very tired-looking Kieran Andreou. I think the latest, we're expecting the flotilla to arrive in Israeli waters sort of early next week. So I imagine we'll be covering that a lot on Novara Live next week. I'm sure we'll be putting updates on our social media throughout the weekend. Tony Blair has a long record of destroying countries in the Middle East, but for some bizarre reason, he's now being proposed as the right man to rebuild one. The BBC are reporting that Tony Blair is in discussions to run a transitional authority in Gaza. Apparently, the proposal has backing from the White House and would see Blair lead a governing authority supported by the UN and Gulf nations. Tony Blair's office has said he would not support any proposal that displaced the people of Gaza. I suppose that's a bare minimum, really, isn't it? Veteran Palestinian politician Mustafa Barghouti gave his response to the plans today.
Well, we don't have all the details of the American plan, but if it is true about appointing Mr. Tony Blair to be some sort of a governor of Gaza, that is absolutely unacceptable, and it makes no sense whatsoever, because Palestinians don't need another colonial power to rule them. Palestinians are quite capable of running their own affairs. And at the end of the day, once the war is over, we need to have new elections within a period of no more than 1 year, because Palestinians have the right to choose their leaders freely and democratically, something they didn't have the chance to do for the last 20 years.
Dropsite News had a few more details today. So they wrote, the White House is backing a plan to install Tony Blair as head of a new Gaza International Transitional Authority, or GITA, a trusteeship modelled on Kosovo and Timor-Leste. It would serve as Gaza's supreme authority for up to 5 years, initially based in Egypt and later entering the Strip with a UN-endorsed multinational Arab force. GITA would oversee a technocratic Palestinian executive authority, run ministries like health and education, create a vetted civil police, and set up a property rights unit to prevent forced displacement. Hamas is excluded. The Palestinian Authority would eventually be phased in, but with no firm timeline. Aaron, your thoughts on Tony Blair being installed as governor of Gaza?
Michael, you tell me. You're smarter than I am. When was the last time this worked?
What happened if it's supposed to be based on Kosovo and Timor-Leste? Did they Did they have international governorships for a while? I mean, I should be clear, I don't think this is going to work. I mean, we've already talked about how Tony Blair is fully backed by Oracle, Larry Ellison, a massive supporter of Israel and the IDF. I think the idea that Tony Blair has the interests of Palestinian people at heart is nonsense and ridiculous. When was the last time it worked? I've got no idea. Maybe never. What do you think? I mean, I'm throwing it back at you.
We had was it the Governor General in Iraq with Paul Wolfowitz? I mean, that guess what? Didn't work. The Brits themselves were involved in Palestine, the Mandate of Palestine. Complete disaster. You know, it led to the State of Israel, the Nakba, hundreds of thousands of people being displaced from their land, just mass violence, 600 British service personnel, police officers being killed, King David hotel bombing, terrorism. That was the last time we had somebody saying, you know what, I'm just going to have a British administrator of Palestine. We're going to sort this all out. We're just going to parachute some dude in with an English accent with a nice suit, and he'll work it all out. It didn't work out last time. So again, it's just, I mean, does Tony Blair, this man is now in his 60s, his 70s. He was the prime minister of this country for 10 years. Does he read books? I mean, this is a question, right? I don't know the guy. We had somebody from the Tony Blair Institute on. Maybe they can answer that. Does the guy read books? You know, I see lots of really interesting books, and there'll be a blurb, Tony Blair, quote unquote, masterful. So Tony Blair's read the book and he's now giving. I don't believe that, because he clearly doesn't read anything, right? Doesn't know anything. It's absolutely wild. And you're of course right to highlight the big conflict of interest. It's not just Larry Ellison. Tony Blair's political career is deeply imbricated with Zionism. You know, the major fundraiser, I think it was Lord Levy, who was, you know, basically the financial savior of the Labour Party. I think his nickname was sort of like Lord Cashpoint or something, because he was so good at raising money for Blair, Lord Levy. You know, again, a committed Zionist. And time after time, you see very high-ranking people in the Blair era of New Labour. They're big-time Zionists. They're not like, oh yeah, I think that, you know, Israel was right in 1967 and the Nakba wasn't so bad. I mean, as in people who are financially, politically motivated by the cause of Zionism. So the idea that Tony Blair, somebody coming from that world with such extensive ties to Larry Ellison, a pattern of failure with regards to foreign policy in that part of the world, I don't get it. I mean, what is driving this other than narcissism and megalomania? You know, Tony Blair, I'm sure he's intelligent enough to know that, you know, his time will be up soon, right? Median life expectancy for a guy of his income, of his background, late 80s, 90s. He's probably thinking, I've got 25 years to really make my mark. I can be the guy who brings peace to Palestine. I mean, that's the megalomania we're dealing with. But I don't think that this is a plan in any way rooted in, you know, historical experience or evidence or just basic rational thinking. It's liquid Blair. You know, he wanted to be, I think, the first president of the European Union. I don't know if you remember this. After he left office, there was this, he wanted to be, you know, a commissioner is slightly different, because after the Lisbon Treaty and so on, there was talk of a president of the United States of Europe kind of thing. And I remember it being such a big deal. It was mooted by all the sort of liberal journalists in London at the time, in the mid-2000s. It'll be Tony Blair. He's our answer to an American president. You know, we need to find a political project which will fit this man's megalomania. It turns out even a think tank with a turnover of $150 million and 1,000 staff advising 40 governments, even that is not enough for this man. He needs to be the governor of the Mandate of Palestine 2.0. Guess what? It won't work.
Presumably would be quite likely that they would just bring in the Tony Blair Institute to run every single department with Larry Ellison and Oracle. I'm not sure how seriously we should take this idea, although I suppose presumably it is being taken seriously in the White House and among some of those Gulf monarchies who are also, in many cases, quite close to Tony Blair. The terrorism charge against Kneecap's Liam O'Hanna, also known as Mo Chara, has been thrown out of court today due to a technicality. The rapper had been charged for allegedly displaying a Hezbollah flag at a London gig last November. His defence team argued that the Attorney General had not given permission for the case to be brought against O'Hanna at an early enough stage in the process, and the judge agreed with them. O'Hanna spoke to hundreds of supporters outside the court.
This entire process was never about me, never about any threat to the public never about terrorism, a word used by your government to discredit people you oppress. It was always about Gaza, about what happens if you dare to speak up. As people from Ireland, we know oppression, colonialism, famine and genocide. We have suffered and still suffer under your empire. Your attempts to silence us have failed because we're right and you're wrong. We will not be silent. We said we would fight you in your court and we would win. Today we have. If anyone on this planet is guilty of terrorism, it's the British state. Free Palestine, check it out.
So this final story also involves Tony Blair because Mo Chara was being charged under the Terrorism Act, which he passed into law in 2000. Aaron Bastani, how is that legacy looking?
Pretty awful, right? And it goes back to that first story about ID cards. Even if you agree with this or that policy, and we don't agree with the ID cards thing, even if you do agree with it, I think it just shows giving the state that much power without any kind of opportunity to take that power back is pretty dangerous. And the Terrorism Act, you look at the Hansard debates when it was introduced in 2000, and people said, oh, this will be fine. People won't overstep the mark. That's exactly what's happened. Michael, by the way, just a quick step back. We've done 4 stories tonight. They're all connected to Tony Blair. This is wild. It's not 1997. It's 2025. Are we going to be here in 2045 still talking about Tony Blair? You know, this dude is never ending. It's quite remarkable. But the key point in this story is if you give that kind of power to the state, it's very hard to take it back. It works as well with taxes, right? Once the government starts to collect a certain kind of tax, once you introduce an income tax, even if it's 1 penny on the pound, once you introduce VAT, once you introduce, inheritance tax, very, very hard to turn back the clock. Things only travel in one direction generally. So you need to be very thoughtful when you put new laws on the statute book. That's something I really believe in. And it's an instinct actually that used to be kind of like a center-right instinct, right? Be cautious about new laws that you create. But now they're like, no, we want to create infinity new laws as well. Prescribe everybody, make everything illegal. So maybe it's time the left clawed that back, Michael. I think it's good to have fewer laws, but better laws.
Well put. I think let's wrap up there. Aaron, thank you so much for taking us on our 20th or 30th anniversary tour of Tony Blair taking over Britain, which he still apparently controls.
He does, yeah. Demographic aging has some downsides, Michael. He's going to be around probably for another 30 years as well. I don't wish harm on him, but I certainly don't want him to be so prominent in the public sphere. Everyone watching and listening, I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
I echo that. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll be back on Monday at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.